Today we'd like to continue our meditation on the Westminster Confession of Faith, which is the confession of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. We're looking at chapter 6 of the confession. If you'd like to follow along, we have it printed for you in the hymnal. It's page 852, and you can read it there as I read along. I'm going to take advantage of my copy of the confession here. Have that handy. It's chapter 6 of the confession. And first, the entire chapter is devoted to the fall of man, of sin, and the punishment thereof. So we consider God's providence, His sovereignty over the course of history and time, His governing all things according to His will. Now we begin to consider the entrance of sin and evil into the world and the implications of that for us and our salvation. So the first section last time talked about the temptation of our first parents in the garden, and the fact that this was allowed by God and according to His sovereign purpose to bring about His own glory. He is glorified in the justice that He reveals against wickedness and evil, and glorified in His own righteousness and provision of grace, which will become apparent as time goes on. But let's then look at the second section, which reads as follows. By this sin they fell from their original righteousness and communion with God, and so became dead in sin, and wholly defiled in all the parts and faculties of soul and body. When we look at this portion of the confession, we see the devastating consequences of our sin upon our first parents, and as we will see later on, that continued on throughout all of their posterity. Today we meditate on the effects of the fall into sin on our first parents, and by implication on us as well. First, for Adam and Eve, they fell from their original righteousness and communion with God. They were created by God on the sixth day as the crown of His creative work. They were given to subdue the earth. They were given the responsibility to cultivate the earth and all of its resources to the glory of God. They were placed in the Garden of Eden, which God Himself had made, and there they were to labor for the Lord. God provided Adam with a helper in Eve, and He gave him all the trees of the garden they eat from, and He had fellowship with Adam and Eve Himself. God Himself met with them in the garden. We will see in Genesis 3 that Adam heard the sound, or more literally, I think, that the voice of the Lord, the sound of the Lord walking through the garden on the day of their temptation and sin. They were familiar with what that sounded like because God Himself had visited with them before that as His creatures and had fellowship with them. He rested on the seventh day, the Sabbath day, with Adam and Eve, and had fellowship with them in that new creation. They enjoyed a righteousness of nature and character and perfect fellowship with God, unhindered fellowship. Yet this was all lost when they took part in that sin of rebellion, when they exalted themselves and what they perceived as opposed to what God said and revealed with regard to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So the sin there was a sin, if you will, of autonomy. They will be a law to themselves. They will set themselves apart from God and do as they pleased and not as God determined. And so the consequence of their sin was to lose that original righteousness and communion with God. That was a tremendous loss. But further, they became dead in sin. You recall that the punishment for eating from that tree was death. And it begins immediately in terms of their spiritual relationship with God. They are cut off from God. They have no fellowship with Him. on the basis of love and friendship. Indeed, they are the enemies of God now, and separated from God, estranged from God because of their sin. And so, therefore, the Bible describes them as dead in sin. This is a description that the Apostle Paul brings up in his letter to the Ephesians in talking to the church. He said that we were once dead in sin. And the image of death is that you have a body that is unresponsive in terms of God Himself and His will and serving Him. The natural man is unresponsive. He's incapable of doing anything good. He's dead in his sins. The confession goes to talk about the consequences of that death in sin as being wholly defiled in all the parts and faculties of soul and body. And so the corruption of man was through and through. It not only affected the lower orders of his nature, passions and feelings and his will, it even affected his mind and his intellect. Some in the Romanist tradition believe that the mind of man was left intact, that he's able to reason truly with regard to the world around him. But in fact, every faculty of our nature was corrupted and polluted by sin. It's corrupted by the fact that our nature is now an unbelieving nature and hostile to God. Listen to what the Scriptures say in that regard. You remember that at the time of the flood of Noah, God looked at mankind, and we read in the 5th verse of Genesis 6, God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Now, imagination, the thoughts of the heart, it's not just the feelings and desires and that sort of thing, but the thoughts of the heart, that which the mind conceives, that was only evil continually. And so the natural man is enslaved to his sinful nature. He is dead in trespasses and sin. The prophet Jeremiah expands on that and says, with regard to the human heart, which is the center and core of our natures, composed of our mind, will, and emotions, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? This was the prophet Jeremiah commenting on the unredeemed, the unregenerate heart, the heart of the natural man who's dead in trespasses and sins. You might be reminded as well of what Paul writes in Romans chapter 3. I won't read the entire section here, but he says this: there is none righteous, no, not one. So the extent of this fall and the sin extends to every human being on earth. As soon as we are conceived and brought into this world, we bear a sinful nature. David, you remember, said in Psalm 51, "In sin my mother conceived me." That's a comment on his nature. Right from the very opening of life, he was a sinner, lost in sin. So Paul says, there's none righteous, no, not one. There's none that understands. The mind is darkened. It is incapable of understanding God and His ways. It twists and distorts it at every turn. And there's none that seeks after God. Sometimes churches are called seeker-sensitive churches, and there is a sense in which the Spirit produces a change in the heart, and then somebody begins to seek for God. But apart from that change that the Spirit brings within the heart, the natural man will not seek for God. He might seek for some religious experience. He might seek for some experience of a God or a divine power in his life, but he's not seeking the triune God of the Scriptures. He's not seeking God through the salvation that He provides through Jesus Christ, who alone is the way to God. And so none of them seek for God. They're all gone out of the way. They're all together become unprofitable. There's none that does good, no, not one. And Paul goes on. So here is the natural man in his state after the fall. His mind is hostile to God. His heart is hostile to God. When you speak to him of the gospel of grace, he has no interest in that. When you talk to him about God as the Creator, he denies it. No matter what evidence you marshal before him, he rejects that. Talk to him about the complexity of the eye. Talk to him about the second law of thermodynamics and how that rules against an ancient earth and all these kinds of things. You can have all the arguments you want. He will twist it and distort it to say that there is no God. And all these things can be explained on natural impulses. And so, the mind of man, the heart of man, is dead in sin. But, that being the case, God is greater than our hearts. God is able to bring new life to those who will hear the gospel of Christ by the Spirit of God. And is able to bring them to life and enable them to live for God. And indeed, to live for an eternity. It is His free gift that He gives to all who call upon the name of the Lord. Call to Him this day, and you will be saved. God is great, and He is greater than our hearts. He can be gracious to you today.